Добрый вечер.
Здравствуйте, товарищи.
It's 10:30 on board the Russian cruise ship Admiral Nakhimov. The vessel has just set out with 888 passengers and 346 crew. It's a warm evening, and the mood on board is cheerful, lively. Many have chosen to retire for the evening, given the late hour of sailing, but for those not yet ready to lay down their heads, a fun-filled evening of socialising and entertainment awaits. Some are dancing the night away out on deck to a jazz band. Others choose to take a refreshing dip in the pool under the moonlight. But those taking in the views out on deck notice a shape in the distance lit brightly with lamps. It's another ship, and it's headed in their direction. The Nakhimov's lights sparkle against the mirror-like surface of the ocean, and under these idyllic circumstances, those on board understandably believe that all is perfectly well. After all, who could possibly suspect that for many of the passengers of the Admiral Nakhimov, this light-hearted and spirited dance would ultimately be their last, because their ship and the stranger in the distance are on a collision course that will take the lives of hundreds. Slowly, inevitably, they draw closer together, but neither changes course until then, with the thunderous tearing of steel, there's impact. The Admiral Nakhimov was a beloved Soviet cruise ship. It had carried excited holidaymakers on summer trips that formed happy memories for tens of thousands, and yet, on a calm, clear night, a third of her complement met their end and the ship was lost. It became a scandal for the Soviet Union in a year of scandal so large that it was ultimately confined to the history books, and few in the West ever even heard the name Admiral Nakhimov. Yet, for the families of victims, the events of that evening are still all too real. It's a bright, sunny afternoon in late summer 1986. In fact, it's the last day of August. It marks the turn towards autumn and the eventual relentless march of the legendarily harsh Russian winter. Tied up at berth 34 of the dock at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea is a gleaming white ship. And at her bow is the name of a long-dead Russian admiral, Pavel Nakhimov, who had led his navy to victory over the Turks just 224 miles, or 362 kilometers away, on the other side of the sea. It's approaching boarding time for the hundreds of passengers who just hours ago stepped ashore on this, day 6 of their 8-day summer cruise. Ukrainians, Russians, Moldovans, they'd all been taken away for a fun summer escape from Odessa right along the northeastern Black Sea coast to Batumi. More than 800 passengers had swarmed ashore at Novorossiysk, a city known for its coastal wineries and distilleries. The ship had arrived at her berth at 2 p.m. that day, and most passengers spent the day excitedly exploring the city, but many of those without the desire to see the sights had opted to while away the hours instead in the comfortable terminal directly across from the ship's berth, and you could hardly blame them for it. The Nakhimov suffered from horrendously bad ventilation because she was not a new ship. Unbeknownst to more than just a few of the ship's passengers, this Soviet cruise ship had actually started life 6 decades earlier in a very different place and time indeed. Germany, 1925. The aftermath of the First World War had left the country's shipping fleet in shambles. Their proud and awe-inspiring trio of superliners, the Imperator, the Vaterland and the Bismarck, had all found themselves in the hands of Allied nations as reparations, and the Treaty of Versailles saw Germany's battleship fleet reduced to bare bones. To get their merchant navy back on its feet, sizable loans were taken out from foreign banks, and while German shipbuilders might have been tempted to immediately begin building the biggest and the best again, they soon realised that a gentler, more gradual approach was needed. The result was a series of modest, mid-sized German ocean liners for the 1920s that struck a balance between utility and luxury, moderate size, and reliability. One liner that came of this post-war effort was the SS Berlin, built by the Bremer Vulcan shipyard for the North German Lloyd Company. She made her maiden voyage in 1925 bound for New York. At just over 15,000 gross registered tons and capable of speeds around 16 knots, she was still a mere shadow of the liners that had come before her. She would never be a blue ribbon contender, and her interiors, lovely enough that they were, would likely fail to thrill the most affluent of society. But she, and the liners like her, were solid, dependable vessels that got companies like North German Lloyd back on their feet. Fast forward to the 1930s, and Germany had once again changed, gripped by the fierce vice of Nazism. The rise of Adolf Hitler and his depraved regime saw the country's merchant fleet used for nefarious purposes in the lead-up to war. In 1939, the Berlin was chartered for a Nazi cruise program, the Strength Through Joy organization, which rewarded hard-working Nazi members of the Labour Front and their families with holidays. But it was a short-lived role. The war erupted that same year, and the Berlin was put to service as a hospital ship. She spent the next 6 years transporting the war's wounded through Norwegian waters and elsewhere in Europe, until all the way at the end in January 1945, when the ship was called up for an all-new assignment, Operation Hannibal. With the German army falling apart on nearly every front, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz made the decision to act in direct defiance of Hitler's official stance of no surrender and no retreat. In fact, this was to become one of the largest sea evacuations ever undertaken, on par only with the Dunkirk evacuations from 5 years earlier. The ultimate objective was to see to the evacuation of around 900,000 German civilians and some 350,000 troops from the Pomeranian coast to Germany and German-controlled Denmark. The SS Berlin, or Hospital Ship A, as she had been renamed, had her own role to play in this, aiding in the transport of troops and refugees from the battlefield. But Operation Hannibal was notable not just for its scale, but for the massive extent of the losses suffered. And on January 31st, 1945, there would be one more ship's name added to that lineup. Hospital Ship A was underway when the ship was rocked by a massive, violent explosion. She had struck a mine. Racing to ensure the ship's survival, the captain and crew made a valiant effort to beach the wounded vessel. The Berlin managed to maintain an even keel and was able to be driven under her own power towards the shore, but as attempts were made to put the ship under tow, a second explosion rang out and she was sunk, coming to rest on the soft, shallow bottom. Abandoned and forlorn, the former SS Berlin sat submerged and exposed to the elements. Just a few months later, in April, the war was over. As ever, to the victor go the spoils, and the Soviet Union, which had lost nearly 30 million people in the war, were going to extract more than a pound of flesh from their adversary. What little remained of the German merchant navy was picked apart and seized by a victorious but vengeful USSR, and even the battered, half-sunk SS Berlin was not immune. Soviet divers were sent to the wreck with instructions to patch the holes punched in her sides and pump the water out from within until she was finally able to float once again. It wasn't easy going. One failed attempt saw the ship rise, only to sink once more, almost killing an experienced salvage diver in the process. But finally, defying death, the Berlin was successfully raised and was sent off for repair. It would take a full 8 years before the ship would be seaworthy again, but in 1949, the Black Sea Steamship Company unveiled her as the newest flagship of their fleet, proudly bearing her new name, SS Admiral Nakhimov. Cruising in the West had enjoyed some popularity before the war, but would only really rise to full popularity in the 1960s. Predating this was the impressive, but now largely forgotten, Soviet cruise industry. It's actually an unlikely story of success. Before the war, the Soviet cruise industry had been a paltry thing, largely thanks to a lack of suitable ships. But the defeat of Germany saw the USSR inundated with a fresh fleet of dozens of medium-sized ocean liners perfectly suited to the task. The Black Sea, in Russia's southwest, offered a unique opportunity for a growing industry. In summer, it's comfortably warm thanks to its subtropical climate. A 6 to 10 day cruise could see a ship pass through a series of Soviet-friendly ports that were as unique and varied as the Union itself. The Admiral Nakhimov was put to work on a schedule that mirrored its Nazi one, a kind of state-run holiday system that rewarded and recharged hard-working families with summer getaways. To the long-suffering peasantry of Russia and Ukraine, who were used to dreary factory or farm work, a week's voyage on a big ship would have been inconceivable and the epitome of luxury. Many chose to spend their 2 weeks annual paid vacation aboard one of the new cruise ships. Surprisingly, the Soviet cruise ships still made use of a class system, and because the secret purpose of the cruises was to make sure workers were rested, one can only assume the voyages were likely nowhere near as decadent and boisterous as their Western counterparts. But still, Admiral Nakhimov and her fleetmates, Rossiya and Pobeda, were immensely popular and served for a shockingly long time. By August 1986, Admiral Nakhimov was 61 years old. The Rossiya and the Pobeda were retired, and soon it would be the Nakhimov's turn. Some even wondered if the 1986 season would be her last, and they were right, but for a reason nobody could ever have expected. Up on the bridge, Admiral Nakhimov's captain, Vadim Markov, along with the officers and crew, prepared to get underway. Passengers had streamed ashore and explored Novorossiysk. Now tour buses lined up to bring them back by their dozens. By 10 PM, the gangways were retracted and 2 tugs came alongside for the departure. The ship was brilliantly lit, the reflection of her sparkling lights creating a glittering effect on the surface of the water. It had been a perfect evening with a glorious sunset. No wonder these cruises were so popular. Aboard there was a party atmosphere. Music could be heard playing from the decks, while underfoot, with a deep rumble, Admiral Nakhimov's engines once again burst into life, and her propellers began to slowly turn. To those watching the ship pull away from the shore, she looked to have all the grace and liveliness of a vessel at least half her age. On board, hundreds of passengers began to settle into the familiar routine of the evening. One was 35-year-old Leonid Toyunda, the head of a Soviet bank branch, rewarded for his hard work with the cruise. In fact, he was joined by 4 of his colleagues. As the Admiral Nakhimov began to pull away from the quay, he and his friends were up top, where celebrations for Miners' Day were well underway. People danced, and they laughed. It had been the perfect summer's afternoon, and now the party would carry on into the night. Shortly after the Nakhimov's departure, the engines slowed and she was joined by a smaller boat. A ladder was lowered from the ship's starboard side to allow an important man to climb aboard. The harbour pilot, who was tasked with navigating the ship through the narrow and precarious channel out to the open water. Pilots are local experts. They know the waterways like the backs of their own hands. Everything about this departure was so ordinary, so routine. The pilot made his way up to the bridge, greeted the captain and the officers, and assumed control of the ship. Nearby, another vessel was making her way towards Novorossiysk. It was the freighter Pyotr Vasev, laden with 28,600 odd tons of barley. Just like on the Admiral Nakhimov, there was nothing out of the ordinary about the evening's routine, and on the bridge, the officers were going about their preparations to rendezvous with their own harbour pilot. An officer radioed the port supervisor with the ship's course and speed, and the supervisor confirmed their message. They also noted the Admiral Nakhimov was on her way out of the port. Pyotr Vasev was asked to yield to the Nakhimov, to which the Vasev responded, "Understood, I will let them pass." On board Admiral Nakhimov, a similar message was received from the port authorities, signalling that the Vasev was nearby and had agreed to yield. Satisfied that all was in hand and that there was no immediate cause for concern, Captain Markov retired for the evening, leaving First Officer Alexander Chudnovsky in charge of the bridge with the harbour pilot. Admiral Nakhimov proceeded ahead on her course while keeping an eye on the freighter, which was now some 7 minutes away into the distance. After waiting for some time, Chudnovsky peered through his binoculars towards the direction of the freighter, but he noticed there'd been no apparent change in the course of the other vessel. By all accounts, the Pyotr Vasev should have been manoeuvring away from them by that point, but, Chudnovsky thought, maybe they knew something he didn't. The Admiral Nakhimov sent a radio message crackling out. "Can we continue on the same course and not slow down?" they asked. "Yes, you can go," came the reply. "Will you let us through?" "Yes, go ahead." Dubiously, they waited and watched. Several long moments passed, and the crew of the Vasev were now beginning to get nervous. Despite repeated assurances from their captain, Viktor Tichenko, that the two ships would pass each other without incident, the once distant passenger vessel was getting closer and closer. The Nakhimov had radioed the Vasev again, verifying that the Vasev did in fact intend to allow the passenger ship to pass. The captain once again signalled that he would yield, but had still not ordered any changes to his ship's course or speed. The Vasev's third officer reported that the bearing on the nearby ship remained unchanged, a huge red flag that any seasoned skipper should have heeded right away. But Captain Tichenko still seemed confident that no change of course was necessary. He thought the two ships would miss. He was tragically dead wrong. The two vessels were on a clear collision course, and it was becoming more and more evident to the crew with every passing second that time was running out. Just moments after assuring his men for the final time that they were in no danger, Tichenko glanced for a moment through a nearby porthole and then fell silent. The realization hit him like a gunshot. He rushed to the engine telegraph, ordering his ship's engines to slow. The warnings from his crew echoed in his head, but now it was no longer a matter of simply altering course. He could only hope he had enough time to avoid a total catastrophe. He sounded 3 short blasts of the ship's horn, a warning of imminent disaster. On board the Nakhimov, Captain Markov had been relaxing in his cabin, his nose buried inside a book, but finally he snapped to attention at the sound of a vessel desperately signalling nearby. He peered out the window, and at the sight of the massive freighter making straight for him, he jumped up and made his way to the bridge. On the passenger ship's decks, the distant horn didn't register any alarm among the passengers. In fact, precious few heard it at all. The music blared, the chatter echoed throughout the ship. Leonid Toyunda and his friends partied under the stars while just a few hundred meters away, tens of thousands of tons of ship was barreling towards them. Nakhimov's first officer, Chudnovsky, anxiously peered through his binoculars looking for even the slightest change to the Vasev's course, but she remained steady. What were they thinking? Time was running out. If a collision was to be avoided, he needed to take action immediately. His stomach in knots, he ordered a 10-degree change to his ship's heading. He looked through his binoculars and began to pray. Aboard the Pyotr Vasev, Captain Tichenko realized the full magnitude of his error. He ordered the Vasev's engines thrown full astern, but even as his ship's propellers began to churn the water behind them into a confused mess, the sheer momentum carried them relentlessly forward. Another radio message came from the Nakhimov. Pyotr Vasev had desperately called out, "What are you doing? Reverse your ship immediately." Weakly, the Vasev responded, "We are reversing," but the freighter was already so close that the crew could plainly hear the music drifting out over the water from the Nakhimov. With the cruise ship coming up on their port side, Tichenko ordered his helm hard to starboard in a last-ditch effort to avoid a collision, but with the engines now running astern, the ship instead took a last-second heading to port, and her head was thrown straight into the side of the cruise ship. Jolt ripped through the Admiral Nakhimov, seemingly to its core as the bow of the Vasev hammered into her starboard side, tearing through the hull like tissue. On deck, Leonid Toyunda was sitting on a bench at the dance when he felt a deep blow at his back. But despite the harsh impact and because of the joyous mood, nobody seemed to know what had happened. With a deep groan, the forward momentum of the Admiral Nakhimov wrenched the bow of the freighter free from her side, leaving behind a 900 square foot gaping hole that allowed the Black Sea to roar in with frightening force. The Nakhimov, which had just been lit so brilliantly against the night sky, suddenly fell into darkness as her boilers and generators were flooded with hundreds and hundreds of tons of seawater. The sudden inrush threw Admiral Nakhimov hard onto her side. Even for those most confused among the passengers, this must have seemed like an obvious portent of doom. A sailor, Sapozhnikov, knew the seriousness of the situation and waited for an alarm, but nothing came. With the Nakhimov rolling slowly onto her side, panic began to take over, and as passengers screamed and ran, Sapochnikov realised they didn't know where they were even meant to be running to. One could only imagine, he said, what the people who got on the steamer for the first time felt. These are 8 decks, 180 metres long, with numerous passengers, nooks, ladders and doors. Even I needed 2 weeks to study this entire metal labyrinth. What can we say about the passengers who knew only a few routes to the restaurant and the exit to the shore? As if the gaping hole left by the freighter weren't bad enough, a fatal flaw in Admiral Nakhimov's character was sending her to the bottom even faster. Her aging ventilation system had meant that every stateroom, every public room was almost unbearably stuffy in the summer. Portholes were left open to try to scoop in some fresh evening breeze, but now, instead of letting in refreshing air, the portholes were slowly lowered into the ocean and let in an unstoppable stream of water. Every row of portholes that was submerged only made the ship sink faster. There was absolutely no time to react. Those asleep in their bunks were awakened only by surging water at their feet, with just seconds to do something. Hundreds died in their cabins. In the darkness, the sounds of screams and the thundering of frantic footsteps running could be heard in every direction. Back up on deck, Leonid Toyunda and his friends received some basic instruction to gather on the port side of the ship in a vain attempt to counter the list. Fighting against the heavy lean, passengers struggled to make their way to the lifeboats, but to their horror they found instead that there was simply no time to launch even a single boat. The Nakhimov was going under, and very quickly. Navy cadets who were aboard for training struggled to unfasten and free the boats ready for launch, but the ship beneath their feet was dropping like a stone. The list made lines and ropes that were normally slack unusually taut, and the boats couldn't be freed. Even so, if they had been, there was simply no time to fill them. Admiral Nakhimov was going down. Only minutes after the impact, passengers and crew resorted to throwing rafts and other makeshift flotation devices overboard in hopes of saving anybody in the water, and then they followed suit, jumping overboard themselves into the dark ocean, slick already with thick motor oil. With each passing second, more and more of the ship was disappearing beneath the waves. Alexander Dolinsky, one of the ship's electricians, had been travelling on board with his wife, Elena, and their infant son, Denis. When the collision occurred, all of his attention had turned to saving his family. Now, up on the boat deck, it was a mad scramble for survival. In desperation, and with his wife frozen in terror, Dolinsky passed his child into a raft that floated free of the deck, when suddenly from above, a lifeboat crashed free of its davits and crushed the raft directly in front of him. On the upper deck, Leonid Toyunda struggled to hold on until the strain proved too great. He was thrown bodily by the ship as it began to roll, and he came crashing down into the cold black water 22 metres or some 70 feet below. He surfaced, gasping for air, and found himself surrounded by his desperate shipmates, struggling in a blind panic to grab hold of anything that would float, including him. He dived and swam away to escape with perfect timing. As he swam below, the ship's enormous funnels came crashing down into the sea, sucking water and people down into their exposed black maws. While pandemonium raged aboard the Nakhimov, the crew of the Pyotr Vasev could only look on in horror as the steamship rapidly rolled onto her side and began to disappear beneath the sea. In the brief moments that the Nakhimov had power, another radio transmission had been sent to the Vasev, this time pleading with the crew to lower their own lifeboats. Now the Nakhimov had once again gone dark. The first officer of the freighter watched on in horror as people slid down the ship's decks into the water. With a thunderous roar, everything that wasn't secured to the ship broke free and rained down on top of them. Boxes, boards, even the life rafts. The ship's power had cut out before emergency lighting had taken over, but even that died with a sudden snap that plunged the dying ship into blackness. Watching on in frozen terror were the crew of Pyotr Vasev, and with the Nakhimov now completely on her side and sinking fast, a frantic radio message went out from the Vasev to the port authorities in Novorossiysk. They tried frantically to coordinate some kind of rescue, but then, to their horror, the Pyotr Vasev's crew realised they couldn't see the Admiral Nakhimov at all. The Admiral Nakhimov had gone under about 11:20 PM, just 7 minutes after colliding with the freighter Pyotr Vasev. In the spot where the ship had once sat was instead a grim sight, a mass of writhing, terrified people fighting to keep their heads above the water, clinging to rafts, life jackets, anything that could float. The ship had been transporting a large volume of green paint, and when it went down it had spilled freely into the sea, along with the tons of fuel. The water's surface became a thick mixture of sludge, and those fighting for their lives were coated in it. Even worse, it was cold. The evening had been nice and warm, but at night time the water became frigid. Leonid Toyunda was separated from his friends and found himself alone in the blackness when he suddenly hit his head on a boat floating free from the wreck. He and 40 more passengers clung onto the side, too weak to lift themselves in. From the bridge of Pyotr Vasev, Captain Chechenko ordered his ship slowly towards the wreck side, intending to pull survivors from the water, but after 20 minutes, he retreated, realizing the dangers of navigating this large freighter through the mass of terrified survivors. The ship's motor launch was lowered and began rescuing survivors from the water instead, while the crew worked to lower the ship's ladders to help those floating near the freighter. Many survivors attempted to climb to safety, but for some, the combination of injury and exhaustion was simply too much. They fell backwards into the sea again, knocking others off as they went. Simply climbing up became an impossible task. For reasons unknown, whether it was due to shock, fear, or a simple oversight, it would take Captain Chechenko another 40 full minutes before he officially reported the sinking to the port authorities. The rescue operation was already well underway by that point, and it seemed that every ship, boat, trawler, and tug on the coast of the Black Sea had been called to action. The pilot boat, LK-90, was the first to arrive on scene, pulling around 118 people from the water onto their comparatively small vessel. It was quickly followed by a veritable flotilla of tugs, motorboats, and patrol boats all ready to aid in the rescue effort. Among the flotilla of boats on hand to help was one which had just helped pull the Nakhimov from her berth scarcely an hour before. They pulled dozens of frightened men, women and children from the water, all of them stained green from the paint. Survivors spent hours clinging on for dear life to anything they could find, while around them others succumbed to their injuries or their exhaustion. When they were finally pulled from the sea, survivors were in varying stages of shock, shaking, covered in oil and paint, separated from their family, their friends, many in desperate need of medical attention, when just hours prior they'd been dancing, laughing, and clinking glasses. At least one woman was pulled alive from the ocean but died shortly afterward from a heart attack. In total, 64 vessels and 20 helicopters assisted in the rescue, and as a result, 836 people survived the sinking. They were the fortunate ones. 359 passengers and 64 crew were lost. Just 10 hours after the ship sank, while survivors were examined in hospitals and given rest, a team of divers was given a grim task: the recovery of the bodies of the victims still trapped within the ship's hulk. Nakhimov had sunk in only around 150 feet of water, so she was accessible, but it was not easy going. Rolled completely onto her side, it was easy for divers to become disoriented in the murky darkness. 2 were killed, so the operation was called off. No attempts to thoroughly search the wreck or further recover victims has ever been made, and it's estimated that 64 people still remain inside the sunken vessel. Admiral Nakhimov, the darling cruise ship of the Black Sea, had become their tomb. Just how had 2 ships collided in such a fatal way in such clear and calm conditions? The question was an awkward one, and it was an indictment on the capabilities of the Soviet merchant fleet. The following year, an extensive investigation was launched by the Soviet government to find who was at fault for the disaster. In fact, the 2 captains had both been immediately arrested pending their evidence. First, Captain Chechenko aboard the freighter, Pyotr Vasev, had failed to alter the course of his ship as instructed in order to let the Admiral Nakhimov pass, and had taken 40 full minutes to report the ship's sinking to port authorities. It was found that he'd ignored the repeated warnings from his crew and the crew of the Admiral Nakhimov to take action in order to avoid the collision. But then, Captain Markov of the Admiral Nakhimov was found to have been negligent too, because he had left the bridge prematurely that evening, and he'd neglected to take charge of the situation that had put the lives of everyone on board his ship in danger. First Officer Chudnovsky of the Admiral Nakhimov was also found to be responsible for having failed to notify his captain of the imminent collision and for failing to follow established protocols to avoid the disaster. Both captains received 15 years imprisonment while Chudnovsky was released. In a move unusual for the Soviet Union, representatives freely gave accurate information to the press as part of a new effort at transparency following the Chernobyl disaster a few months earlier. But probably because of the severity of that disaster, the Nakhimov sinking went underreported in the West. The New York Times ran a larger front-page piece about elementary school overhaul than it did about the Nakhimov's loss. Leonid Toyunda survived his ordeal and was sent to recuperate in the countryside, but just weeks later, at age 35, his hair had turned permanently grey. For several years after the sinking, a yearly pilgrimage was made by families and loved ones of the victims. A memorial was opened, and at 11:20 PM, the exact moment the ship was lost, sirens and signals blasted out as the memorial was brilliantly lit up in tribute to the lost. Today, the Admiral Nakhimov lies rusting and covered in sea growth just below the surface, a steel mausoleum to the passengers still inside that will never disembark.